Welcome, everyone. We have a bunch of folks here who are joining us, who are experts in the monitoring and observability space. So rather than me doing introductions, I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. Tell us who you are, who you work for, what you do. So let's kick it off. Let's go alphabetically and start off with Ashley Miller.
Hey, thanks for having us today. I'm super excited about Failover Conf today. I'm Ashley. I'm a Senior Director of Engineering at Datadog. I've been at Datadog for 3.5 years. I've touched lots of products. My current area of responsibility is what can be understood as sort of this API layer. So the scalability and reliability of our main web app, authentication, access control, login, and letting people query their infrastructure. That's kind of my world. And thanks for having us today.
Thanks. APIs, such an interesting layer. I've got a bunch of questions for you in a bit, but moving on, let's move over to Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm with Dynatrace for around 6 years now. I'm their Director of Technology Strategy, and I'm leading the open source office there. So my team is mostly responsible for everything like that is coming soon or that we see in the industry, and interesting projects, interesting communities, but also support for things also within the product. One part of my team, for instance, we do Captain, that's an integration layer for a control plane for Kubernetes and CI/CD. So yeah, we collect basically what's out there in the market and see how things going. Yeah.
Very cool. Next, we'll go to Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm Honeycomb's VP of Engineering. Before Honeycomb, I love developer tools. So my last couple companies have all been developer tools companies. And I spent a lot of time in the web performance and monitoring space before seeing the light of observability and jumping over to Honeycomb.
Nice. And last but not least, Stijn.
Hey, good day, everyone. So my name is Stijn. I am a Director of Developer Enablement at New Relic. What this means is I lead our overall strategy on kind of how we enable developers to use our various tools and APIs and capabilities. My team has built our documentation side, our developer side, open source side, various kind of backend services related to like self-learning experiences and content. It doesn't mean that we're building the content itself. So my team is really responsible for the infrastructure where our content is being placed. So very excited to be here. Looking forward to this panel discussion.
Awesome. So we did have a bunch of questions from our attendees. And so I think one that's a good one to start off with, and because it's about starting off, Emmeline Gallard, who's a lead backend / DevOps in France, asked, when is the best time to start working on observability? And Emily, you had mentioned moving from monitoring to observability. So let's start with you on that.
I think that everyone wants to say, like, right at the beginning, right as you're getting started, you want to think about it. But I know that for so many of our customers, that's not the reality. So I think that one of the most useful things to do is just to accept that journey is an iterative process, and there's kind of no bad time. You can always start small and go bigger, for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious, as a follow-up with that, you mentioned an iterative process. What sort of things are you looking for as you're doing this process? What sort of friction points are you looking? How do you prioritize what that iteration looks like?
I think for us, we always, at least for our engineering team, we're always trying to be in conversation with our code, right? Charity Majors is our Honeycomb CTO and my boss, and she uses the phrase observability-driven development. And her idea there is that you're always kind of doing this loop of going, okay, I'm going to instrument my code as I'm writing it. I'm going to deploy it to production. I'm going to look at the answers my instrumentation is giving me. And then you don't stop there, right? If there's questions you can't answer, you continue to add more and add more. So you kind of start with the basics, the things you're most familiar with, and then expect to go through that loop a couple more times before you can kind of answer every question.
Yeah. Ashley, I'm curious along with you, the API at Datadog, having been around for a long time, I'm sure it's evolved. I'm guessing that you've got some insight on this as well.
Yeah, I think, especially when you're starting off thinking what really matters to you, sort of building on what Emily said, you sort of start with, start simple, know that the things are working, and, build your, don't worry about the things around it, being able to understand that your API is up. If you care about latency early on, like that's where you spend your time. At Datadog, we certainly have gone from simple like monitors and does this API work to moving into things like application traces, right? And seeing end-to-end how your distributed system looks. But that's not where you start. And so being able to think about where you are and what you need rather than where you think you'll be in a few months or years.
Yeah. I'm curious along those lines. So Daniel, in your introduction, you mentioned Captain, and I know that that's a really new project, right? It's CNCF sandbox project right now. So I'm imagining that your view on this might be a little different. So talk to me about, if you do have that opportunity to start fresh with brand new software, what's your approach?
I mean, I completely share that sentiment also of Emily and Ashley. I mean, premature optimization is the root of all evil, and you can always start to kind of build this huge observability stack before you have written one line of code. And as a developer, I feel like this is also the most fun sometimes, like working on those greenfield things. To be frank, I mean, with Captain, this is one topic of its own. This is, of course, about monitoring or having observability through your whole pipeline. So this is really about SLOs and quality gates and seeing what's happening like before you even go into production. But most importantly, I would say, even if you start from a greenfield or if you are in a microservice environment or like do a microservice migration more or less, I think in a perfect world, you would start rather early because you can then define your baselines because you have a way to measure yourself against it. I think that's pretty key. How you never know which response time, which latency is good or which is bad. It's always kind of a comparison to some other state. And getting this state rather early, and just maybe also on a low level, maybe you don't even need tracing or anything. Just collect some base metrics, know how fast is it now, for instance, very in simple terms. And after the next deployment or next iteration, the next service I added, how many percents did I gain or lose? I think that's the most important thing to get. But I share the sentiment to start rather simple instead of over-engineering it.
Yeah, definitely. I think everybody here resonates with the premature optimization statement as being quite evil. You did mention tracing there. So Stijn, I know New Relic traditionally has been, that's where you started, right? With doing a lot of that tracing and profiling kind of work. Curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think we're all very much in agreement here. Taking an iterative approach is the way to go. One thing I would add to kind of like that initial set of like requirements, exploring, why do I need observability? What can it give to me? Is think about kind of the service you're building, the product you're building, and what stakeholders are expecting. So to give you a very specific example, in our case, when we're building our documentation site, of course, we care about uptime and availability. We want every user to be able to go to our site, read our documentation. But actually, we have a very interesting side effect as well. We have a responsibility towards our internal writers, so the people that write content for the documentation site. And because of kind of the way our documentation site was built, it is very important for us that we minimize the build time. So whenever we make big changes to the site, we don't want people, contributors, to have to wait for hours. Right. So in our case, that's a very specific metric, almost like a goal we want to achieve. We want to make it easy for content writers to write content and almost immediately see them being kind of deployed in production. So that's kind of the first area I would say. If I were to start like at a simple level, at a simple observability level, I would first focus on those uptime levels like? Making sure that the site is accessible. And then, of course, we get into like the deeper questions. Yeah, what if it's not accessible? What's happening? And this is where, obviously distributed tracing comes in. APM capabilities to really understand, what's happening. Do I have a problem somewhere in my source code? Is it maybe a database that is failing? But I would say start simple with kind of the high level uptime goals and think about what purpose does my feature software product have to the rest of the business.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Obviously, uptime very important, but I do love that measuring the speed, right, of how fast build times are. I'm curious if let's go around. What are the, let's say, top handful, maybe couple or three SLOs or key metrics that you're actually measuring your teams or your internal performance on? Start with Emily.
Well, we've got the classic ones that everyone would expect. So, we're looking for error rates below a certain threshold. We're looking for API and UI availability below a certain threshold. There's a couple of ones that we use that are maybe a little less common. So we have a number of SLOs around front-end performance. We want to also measure client side, because if the website is slow or if there's some JavaScript throwing an error, that's going to be just as damaging to our users as stuff on the back-end server side. And then for us, Honeycomb, we were like the high cardinality. We love talking about high cardinality. So we also have a number of SLOs that are across specific user types or customer types, where we want to make sure that the experience is just as good for our, maybe a small team using our free plan versus a giant enterprise team. A lot of times the smaller team traffic can kind of get lost in the noise, and we want to understand across a couple of different dimensions, not just overall are people seeing 4 nines of uptime.
Yeah, I'm curious, Ashley, any additional metrics?
Yeah, I think it's important for teams to think about what matters, and not just from yourself, but from your customer's perspective, right? Like if I have an internal API that's called 4 times a day for whatever reporting reason, latency probably doesn't matter a ton there. But when I call it, it should work. So uptime is very important there. We think about end-to-end latency. So ingesting metrics, we're looking at trillions of data points a day. So being able to scale and process those very quickly is what our customers care about. So we're measuring that. We're thinking about latency on endpoints, going back to what Daniel said, things about your baseline is important, and you want to make sure that as you add features, as you scale, that those endpoints are still responsive. And I think it's important for every team to sit down and think about that. Like, how do I impact our customers? What do they care about? Do I have rock solid like SLOs on that, metrics, monitors, all of that?
Yeah. I'm curious. So one of the other questions that we got, and that I'm going to open up to folks, is from, I believe it's Ang-Gi Ko, who's a DevOps lead in Singapore. And they asked, what are the key metrics to identify if a DevOps transformation is successful? Now, I know all of you haven't really done a DevOps transformation, or I don't imagine that you have, knowing what your companies are like. But that said, I think the key to DevOps is largely about how teams function, across teams, and how they just operate internally in terms of a cultural piece. So I'm curious, along with these recommendations of what technical metrics to watch, do you watch any sort of team performance or cultural metrics? So I'll open this up to Daniel.
Yeah, I was just thinking what this could be, to be honest, but I think that from a DevOps perspective, and I think this is the metric also when we went on this DevOps journey, was about how many deployments do I have? How fast do I deploy? Can I roll back easily? If there is something wrong, what's my mean time to resolution? So that would be metrics I look at. But to be very frank, I would not know to which baseline to compare it, to be honest. So you can still just see how far you improve yourself. So it's more, I would say this is more an OKR than a metric like a real like hard metrics that you would see from an observability standpoint, because let's be frank, the DevOps transformation is not just a technical move, that's also a cultural move. So there are a lot of more aspects. So then I would even pull into this thing the satisfaction of my team. Yeah, how happy are they with the new with the culture of overall. So this, I would say, we engineers, we tend to find engineering solutions, but I think some things, especially with cloud migration and DevOps and all of that, are cultural things also as technical ones.
Yeah, I think some of those metrics that you mentioned about velocity feed into what Stijn had mentioned earlier. Stijn, I'm curious if you've got any other metrics that you monitor for this sort of DevOps success in terms of culture.
Yeah, there are many angles to kind of the DevOps philosophy. I think Daniel touched upon a really important one, like speed of deployment. So I think instrumenting the CI/CD systems we're putting in place is an important one. What I would also, or what I have also looked at is not only kind of the time to deploy something to production, but really starting from the ideation phase. So when is a ticket created until when is the feature deployed to production? So really trying to map out the entire almost software life cycle of a feature or of a capability. I think the other thing is, especially in a DevOps world, is shared visibility, like transparency. So making sure that teams like see data from other services, that you're transparent about the data and the things that are happening in an environment. I think not only is this at the foundation of what DevOps is really about, but in practice, when you run into issues, when you are woken up in the middle of the night and being paged, it actually helps. If you get visibility maybe into another API endpoint you're consuming, and you can see that API backend service is actually having like a database error or something like that. Look, those insights can help you get down to the root cause faster. So that shared knowledge, I think, improves our overall confidence in using DevOps, I guess, methodologies. The other kind of, maybe the other aspect to it, which is, we could debate, is this DevOps or not, but in my world, a lot of it is around open source. So what we're actively trying to do is build communities. We're trying to support the communities. We're trying to leverage many open source projects out there. So one of the things that I'm also looking at is, okay, how successful are we? First, are we using open source technologies, but also are we contributing back? So how many forks do we have on our own? How many PRs? How many stars? How many, like, really trying to take a more data-driven approach on how is the community benefiting from some of the work, and how are we contributing back as well? So yeah, I think it's another angle, maybe not like the core DevOps aspect, but the open source world around it. I would also bring into the picture.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thinking about not only the interactions of your own engineers, but also including, if you have open source projects, the contributors are essentially engineers on your team, despite not actually being employees. I'm curious, Ashley, if you've got thoughts about that, because I do know that a lot of what you've been working on also includes open source.
Yeah, everything that you run on your infrastructure from Datadog is open sourced. I think that's important. We also contribute back to libraries that we're using. You know, the maintainer of Yarn works at Datadog, so we have a strong open source game. But I think one thing also, going back to what Stijn had said, is like that shared view of the world is actually one of the major differentiators. Everyone's using the same system to collect metrics, the same view of the world. You know, if there is a problem, I can look at someone else's system and see, aha, they have an alert. Maybe this is why my system is seeing latency. And that is like a huge mind shift. A lot of places have, you know, their own Grafana setup or their own internal tools or their own accounts, and just bringing them all together, I think is a really good and simple way, like in addition to the mean time to resolution or how long it takes to deploy, but are you just like swimming in the same data world?
Yeah. So I guess along with those, obviously there's well, let's try to unify the tool. And if everybody's in the same tool with the same access, that's obviously a way to help. I'm curious if you've got any tips for the process around that, like everything outside of the tool, right? Because the challenge that I've had, and I think a lot of the attendees have had, is cool, I have access to everything, and yet I'm seeing a list of hundreds of dashboards. How do I know which one, right, like actually involves that other service? How do I know who to contact and things like that? Curious if you've got any tips for the people side of that.
I'll start, but I want to like not monopolize this. So I think that's something we put a lot of thought in. If you do a good job on instrumentation, you end up with just a lot of stuff around, right? And so Datadog does things like Watchdog, which highlights metrics that are going wrong for you. So I think things we can do with machine learning can just give you the box that shows you what's wrong. But we do a bunch in terms of relevancy, showing you things that are in use versus things that aren't, showing you who's looking at your dashboards. I think those are like subtle things that help surface what's important to you. And of course, there's the spectrum from highlighting it for you to sort of guiding you to the right place. But
cool. Daniel, I think you had something to add to this.
Yeah, I'm first, I agree with Ashley. I'd like to add, yeah, of course we have everything AI, and you can get like right to the problem. We all know that, and this is not a product pitch. I think it's more important to see that now with the transformation that we are seeing, and this is very much also what I saw throughout my career. When I started at Dynatrace 6 years ago, I was new to the monitoring space, and I was a developer, and I wanted to talk to developers, and everyone told me, no, this is not really the people that care about observability or monitoring at all. Yeah, this has extremely changed throughout the last, I would say, 1 or 2 years. Yeah, suddenly I can talk at the Spring One conference. No one cared before about anything observability there. So I think that, and there we have a different altitude, and suddenly also different personas inside a company that care about observability, and they might also have a different needs from a tool. Yeah, while like this classical enterprise monitoring, they look more, so like this platform team that looks over 2,000 services, they care about aggregates. They want to know the general health of their stuff. Yet this one service team, they are responsible for this Node.js middleware. They might just want to see their 5 services and how they are performing. And I think that the challenge, like right now, is to make all these personas more or less happy. And I think this is also like the core of this observability movement is to make this possible for also engineering teams to have this high granularity view on their very particular data. I think that's an important aspect of what data actually is. Yeah, and I think everyone that is in the industry a little bit longer has sees this transformation going on right now.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned, that idea of shifting left on monitoring observability is definitely something that's made a huge impact in our industry. Particularly thinking of how we've taken that and really built out a community, thinking of things like open tracing, open telemetry. I'm curious, Emily, I know Honeycomb's been heavily involved in that, as all of these companies have been, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that and how you see that movement of opening up, and creating these communities has actually changed things.
Yeah, open telemetry has been, it's hard to overstate how big a deal it's been and how huge it's been certainly for Honeycomb, but I think for all of us. One, I think it does a really nice job of pulling developers into the process of thinking about instrumentation, right? All of a sudden, it is a project that you can be a part of. You can help define how the standard is going to work. And I think, before this moment, instrumentation was something that the vendor handed you. You didn't really think that much about it. You sort of got what you got. And we're entering this world where I think all of a sudden people are a little more in dialogue with thinking about what data they want to collect. And it feels a little more like it's something that's in your own hands, which is a really, really cool shift for sure. I think, one other thing that I hope will come out of this that I think we're just starting to see happen is that so many of our frameworks were not really designed to get this kind of rich data out. And all of a sudden, now that it's not just vendors trying to get that data out, now that we've got kind of a shared group of people, we are starting to see changes in how people are actually writing their frameworks and kind of some of the underlying tools that developers are using to get better data out, which is a cool shift. And certainly, I think makes all of us happy because it will be able to get people better data more easily.
Yeah, Stijn, I'm curious if you've got things to add there.
That's a great point, Emily. And I think we're already seeing some really exciting things in this area. Whether it's open telemetry or the open metrics Prometheus format, many services, many technologies that we use are adopting these standards and are exposing, data metrics in one of those standards. So I think that's really, really exciting to see, because in a way, I think this is evolving into where we're going to get at a place where instrumentation itself is commodity. Like right now, we're still putting a lot of thought into, okay, what metrics do I need to collect? How do I, which library do I include to expose the metrics and stuff like that. But this is all, in my opinion, going to become commodity. So we can really focus on the value of the data. What are we using the data for? Well, we want to be able to troubleshoot faster. We want to be able to kind of be proactive, act before something bad happens. So that's really exciting about me and the space that we're almost commoditizing the instrumentation part itself. So we can focus on really solving our daily kind of problems with the data we have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point of moving from, just monitoring to using that data. And I think that leads into one other question from our attendees. Shruti Naidu as an SRE in India.
Hi everyone, my name is Shruti and I'm from Bangalore, India. My question to the panelists today is how exactly can we evolve from an eyes on glass approach to monitoring to something better?
I think really asking that point of how do we set up better uses of this data to get informed, right? So Ashley, I'm curious if you've got thoughts on that.
Oh, yes. So I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think going back to thinking about things that matter to your customers. So where you actually start to create a story with your data so that you can say, I'm looking at a particular graph, or I'm looking at this graph plus this trace, and I know exactly what someone's experiencing, and looping that back into your development process. There is the having infrastructure that proactively is well monitored, is very observable. You know what's going on, that goes out and pages you, so you have more of a push when things are happening. Is another way to think about it. So that's kind of where I see things going, is you have data that's much richer, going back to some of the trends we're talking about, where you can actually not just go to a dashboard or go to a search page and see what's happening, but you actually are proactively pulled in when something's happening, and you can query and ask questions of your data in a way where you're actually exploring and being able to tease out trends that maybe you didn't expect to see before.
Yeah, Daniel?
Yeah, I think the most important thing about the lots of data is putting the data into context. So where do these metrics come from? Let's look at the topology. On which hosts is this thing running that is now slow? So do we see other problems on this host? So this whole bunch of putting data into a context, really, that's also this whole observability story after all. So otherwise you can pull out, create 100 dashboards, and there you see there is something slow on the latency, but then you start digging and start to go into logs and look at or you have to have a lot of domain knowledge. You have to know, oh, they just deployed something there, and maybe it's because of that. So all of that stuff, you should really have this all at your fingertips. How you then like derive your learnings from it, or your knowledge gain. We say that AI is the solution. It depends also, again, on the altitude. Sometimes slicing and dicing might be a solution you might go into. So that really depends. But it's really about knowing everything that's happening around this data point, not just this one data point on class.
Yeah, Emily, I'm curious if you've got thoughts about that that idea of adding more context and trying to get to the story.
Yeah, for sure. I also just want to plus one something that Ashley said about, having that user-focused perspective, I think is so important. So for us, a really important part of this, part of our tooling here is service level objectives, or SLOs. So, you kind of, those help you get beyond that. We've got a green dashboard, but some customer is having a problem. We have burn alerts set up if we're burning through a small amount of our budget, but over a sustained period of time. And those can really help you see those kinds of issues where it's still a problem for your customers, even though it's not showing up on the big, the whole world view. In terms of context, I would say certainly being able to correlate across different, types of tags or different types of information you're adding to your data is such an important part of this. And I think all of us as people who work on these kinds of products are thinking about how to make that experience smoother and easier. It has been really cool to see vendors go in so many different directions. So there's some, like, let's solve it with AI. There's also some, how can we just make the searching for that one dimension that's slightly strange a little bit faster. That's definitely our approach, is the empower human operators, run all those queries faster, and just show you all the results and let you pick it out with your eyeballs.
So we're all on this panel and we're all doing Zoom, obviously, as a recording, although hopefully the video ends up really nicely and it seems a bit more seamless. But I'm curious, let's take a slight pivot, because obviously we are in pandemic world. None of us are able to come together in person at a conference, although I'd love to be able to hang out with all of you and just like chat over some beers. But I'm curious, on your own teams now, the idea of moving to completely distributed, I think, has changed the way that a lot of engineering teams have worked. So I'm curious if you could talk about how it's affected your teams and what you're seeing, particularly around when it comes to monitoring your services and having to respond to incidents. So I'll start with Ashley.
Hi, I love being the first in the alphabet. So I think it's been a couple of things. I think it's made instrumentation and sort of thinking about what your monitors are and, sort of how you're alerting a little bit more. Like, it almost becomes a means of communication, because now people who used to be in the same place are in different time zones. There's a lot of things that's happening asynchronously. So the more, you talk about context and story, it becomes even more important in those dashboards or in your monitoring story. The second is to do a little bit more human things, which is look back and look for trends, right? If you're sitting together, those things naturally happen. That's not, you have to be a lot more intentional. I think we've all found that, from one-on-ones to like code reviews to all of this stuff, like things that just happened organically now have to be intentional. And we do that the same thing with looking at things that have launched, what has changed, what are, if there's an incident, what has happened, is there a common theme there, and then using that to sort of feedback. And that's been really interesting. I think that, like, as companies get more global, as even small teams are quite distributed, this provides like a pretty good model, and we'll see more and more of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to Stijn.
It's really crazy times, right? If you think about this, I have some engineers in my team. I've never met them in real life because they were hired over the past month. So it's pretty crazy. I think the other thing I would call out is, if we talk about monitoring or observability in this situation, in this context, think about integrating them into the tools you use on a daily basis. For example, I think this is probably true for all of us here. We live almost like on Slack. Like a lot of our communication goes via Slack. So integrating kind of, alerts, alert policies in the tools you're using on a daily basis makes it just easier to make sure that the communication flows the right way. The other thing is, especially even more in this virtual world we're in today, like doing these post-mortems. So like learning from things that failed, making sure that you take actions to, improve what might have caused an issue, also see improvements for processes, for improving your processes itself. Like, are we using the right tools? Is there an opportunity to kind of bring in more data in kind of a single platform, for example, and get that better holistic view on what's happening? So those are some areas that are top of mind for me.
Yeah. Daniel, I'm curious if you've got thoughts on the whole working now remote and being asynchronous.
Of course, I mean, we are still in a privileged industry where this all is possible after all. So it did, from a cultural point of view, it did not change like too much. We lived on Slack before, I would say. But I think what changed is this like ad hoc stuff that you had going on before, or like war rooms that you could do and pull everyone into one room. Even more now, it's important to look at the same data as it was already said. So like having the same data in front of them. If there is a problem, maybe through automation, get the right people pulled into the conversation, where we have some approaches where the right people get a message from Slack, and we also know, maybe we know, for instance, people that are affected by a problem, and also who might be, like, I would say, connected to the root cause of a problem. So kind of to reduce the noise of those old people coming up and saying, hey, something is broken. And then the whole noise makes it hard for those people that try to figure out the problem to kind of come together. So I think that is something we see, and we also see at customers a lot, that it's way more important. The virtualization, everything going virtual, also we see that there is a lot more need for like observability at companies. I have the impression, really, because now they feel they need more automation. They need more look at the same data. They think way more about all these things. And one thing I want to also mention about like developing in such a world in general is we try to go more and more in a direction that is called inner source, where we try to adopt open source techniques also in the way we work internally, to have formalized ways how decisions are made. Because now, and I would say Dynatrace was very famous for this development headquarter in Linz, where we all stand at the coffee machine and talk things out. This was possible for some time, but now we're too many people anyways. And now through the pandemic, we learned that we really have discussion, like dedicated discussion issues, where we discuss things without excluding someone that might just not be at the coffee machine today. So that is, I think, one important thing. And this goes beyond monitoring, of course, but I think it's important. Asynchronous, formal communication and discoverability of information within the company is, I think, very important.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'm imagining a lot of tech people who had really, really keen barista skills and latte art skills are now maybe suffering. But that said, I think what you mentioned combined a little bit with what Stijn had mentioned about onboarding, a lot of new people and not having met some of these new coworkers. I'm curious, as companies are growing, a lot of what we're talking about, there's a lot of context and things that experienced team members just know. And so I'm curious, let's talk about a little bit how we onboard engineers and how we bring them up to speed. So Emily, I know your team has been growing a lot. Curious, how do you handle this? How do you onboard new engineers so that they get that context, so they understand what they're looking at when they're in the tools, when they're having to monitor services?
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, the Honeycomb engineering team was like 8 or 9 people at the start of the pandemic, and now we're over 20. So we have more people that we've onboarded after than before. So it's definitely been a big challenge for us. I think one of the most important things we have always done, but have leaned harder on, is just putting as much context as possible closest to the tools that people are using every day. You know, one of the things we see is so often in the past, your coworkers were actually people who helped you navigate internal documentation. You know, someone sitting next to you was going, oh, you got to pull up this runbook over here, and then there's this write-up over here that's going to help you, know what to do with the Kafka cluster, all that. And as much as possible now, we're trying to move that context into the alerts so that, the first thing you see kind of gives you all those pointers and helps you navigate in a way that, someone sitting next to you might have done before. I also will just say Zoom has been a huge part of it, not hesitating to jump on Zoom for an incident. It used to be primarily that our response was in Slack, and we find that because people don't know each other quite as well, they don't anticipate each other's textual cues quite as well, just jumping into Slack can really help make that process be smoother and kind of substitute in for having that in-person knowledge of each other that you're translating over to that text space.
So I'm curious along with that, because one of the reasons that I love Slack for jumping into incidents is you have a log of everything. So it definitely helps when you're going into that incident review. I'm curious, are you now doing Zoom and Slack, or is it just Zoom? Tell me about that process.
We absolutely use both, and we are in the habit of just dropping things into Slack to save them for the incident review as we're in Zoom. So people will show, you'll screen share, show a graph on Zoom, and then immediately paste the link into Slack. So it's definitely why not both.
Nice. Ashley, I'm curious about you because your team's been growing as well. How do you onboard new engineers?
Yeah, we are pretty formal about two pieces that I really like. I didn't see it before coming to Datadog, and it was super good. There's like a buddy who's social, like join this Slack group. This is how lunch works. And a mentor who's not your manager, who like is there where you're like, I do not feel comfortable asking my manager how to like set up my dev environment. And I think that's really like, it's very like nice. But some of it too, like what you guys have talked about, like putting context where you are talking to people, like doing things as much as possible over Zoom. Like I encourage my team to have one-on-ones with each other beyond just the matrix of one-on-ones, just to know people human-wise. And that makes a huge difference because you never get away from the like person next to you kind of explaining how things work. So no matter how wonderful your documentation is.
Yeah, I'm curious. Let's take this idea and maybe slightly shift it, because I know Daniel and Stijn both work with a lot of open source. So Daniel, I'm curious, as you mentioned, doing open source, how do you onboard new community members?
I mean, community members onboarding, that's another thing, because it's also a challenge to build the community at first, right? So when you come into the situation that you have to like onboard new community members, then you already have won. Yeah, I would say that's the biggest challenge, getting a lot of contributors on projects, to be honest. And then we are back, and this is at what open source is super good at. Open source, and this is also like what I would take to this whole inner source, a little bit of a brainchild right now of mine. But what I take there is, in open source, you have documentation that tells you how to contribute to this thing, or how to build this thing, how to make it run, how to test it. There are procedures in place that link this stuff before I even am able to do a pull request. So I have tickets that are hopefully so self-explanatory that I can start. Maybe it's a good first issue and it's marked at that. So there is nothing more ideal, or we as proprietary software vendors as well, we can learn so much from open source. So onboarding new community members is actually, I would say, if you cannot get this right, you have done a lot wrong along the way, because there are a lot of good practices that are established and that we should all live maybe more inside our companies as well, I would say.
Yeah, I love that idea of applying open source to inner source and really having that open source model affect your company. Stijn, I'm curious, how have you seen what you do for onboarding external contributors really helping you onboard new team members within the company?
Yeah, Daniel touched upon a really important thing, I think, which is around the guidelines, contributor guidelines, maintainer guidelines. And what I would add to that is, well, maybe take a step back first. I've been in situations where I wanted to contribute something to an open source project, and it takes like 6 weeks before someone reviews a pull request. By that time, I'm frustrated and I'm running away. So I think it's really important, if we think about establishing an open source community, a project, really think about the support model, like the model around it. It's not just, hey, we're pushing something out and there it is, the community will take care of it. No, we need to make sure we have the right maintainers who take responsibility over, GitHub issues or whatever tools we're using, like issues being filed, pull requests being created, reviewing them, and in a positive, constructive way, really helping first-time contributors to have a great experience. Because what I've usually seen is that first-time contributors, they're really excited. They're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get my hands on this project. They come to you with a high intent. So it's up to the kind of maintainers to keep the intent at a high level. Make sure that there is high quality code review, that there are processes in place to easily accept contributions. And then finally, that you think about automation. So what we've done with our teams a lot is kind of building, for example, GitHub Actions to automate a bunch of things. For example, creating releases, it could be updating documentation. And again, to really support those contributors so they immediately can see the value of the work they're doing, because it's getting pushed through an entire system of, I would say, support and onboarding and engagement. So.
Yeah, definitely taking those developer tools that we take for granted within a company and starting to apply them out to that open source community. So I think we've got time for one more question. So as we've been doing this conference, a lot of it has been thinking about the evolution of how things have changed over the past year, right? Given the circumstances. But I want to take a step and start to think about the future and what do things look like in a year from now or 3 years from now. And so let's go around, and I'm curious if you can share, what do you think is the biggest challenge in the monitoring and observability space that we're going to have to tackle in the next, say, 1 to 3 years? And what would that be, just so that our attendees can start forward thinking and thinking of the things that maybe they need to start thinking about solving that are going to be coming down the pipeline. So we'll go alphabetically for this one. Ashley, next 1 to 3 years, what's the biggest challenge?
Well, if we want to talk small grained, I'd say tagging. It is the perpetual, like how you tag your infrastructure, that is always tricky for everybody. But I think the big thing is you see more and more moving to multi-cloud, even for smaller teams, thinking about which just like vastly complicates things. So I think that's going to be a big one. And the other one is being able to have a really nice context has come up a lot in this conversation. And I think it's on all of our companies to try to provide that in the like most up-to-date and clean and intuitive way, even as you have companies working on like deployed in very different ways. Like, some in classic, some workloads running in serverless and some running maybe on like managed Kubernetes, right? Like, and I think that's a mental model. You're asking people to think about things in different ways. And I think finding the right tool set to make all of that clear and provide the appropriate context as you look through things is going to be a challenge for these companies, but also for like engineers to pick the right kind of tool set.
Yeah. Daniel, biggest challenge in the next 1 to 3 years?
I would say speed of innovation, multi-cloud environments, lots of tool sprawls, but also service sprawl, because every like every infrastructure vendor comes up with the whole set of services that you want to use, but at the same time you want to monitor is, as Ashley mentioned, it's a serverless, and that's just the beginning. Then I think what will come, and I think what will be more important, will something around business events, to be also able to kind of collect more business events and metrics and more about that. That will come. Logging will be way more of a topic, and put it into context, very also in line with where OpenTelemetry is headed. So I see a lot of like noise or buzz coming up with how important logs are and how important events are. As soon as OpenTelemetry also moves in this direction, because then also developers start to use it. So I think that would be an important thing. And yeah, I would say really it's all about speed and a lot of microservice migrations that are ongoing. We should not forget that like we are always a little bit ahead of the curve, because we're like a little bit more on the very tech side, but when we talk with some customers, they're just on the beginning of the whole microservice journey. So this is something that will change the whole like space a lot, I would say.
How about for you, Emily? Biggest challenge in the next 1 to 3 years?
Daniel and Ashley definitely touched on pieces of what I'm seeing, but I think there's a technological challenge and a people challenge. So the technology one, and you can see all the vendors kind of moving in this space, is being able to correlate across, from your metrics to your traces, being able to jump back and forth more easily between those worldviews. But we also find that as the tooling gets better, as Ashley mentioned, managing the mental model of what's happening in those systems becomes like a more kind of present challenge. We can find answers to questions we couldn't answer before, but that means that all of a sudden the engineer who has the best mental model of the system is like wildly more equipped to debug than the other people on the team. And so how do we bring everyone up to the level of that person more quickly? And the tools play a part in this, but I also think there's a lot of cultural pieces we have to work out as well.
Absolutely. And lastly, Stijn, biggest challenge in the next 1 to 3 years?
Yeah, so great points. I would want to come back to what we talked about earlier about instrumentation and how it's becoming so easy to instrument, get data from our systems, our services, our businesses. And today we're very much focused on the known things, the known metrics, the known metrics that cause or that symptoms for outages, etc. What I think we will gonna have to focus more on the coming years is what we've called like the unknown unknowns. Because with the explosion of all of the data, the metrics, logs, the traces, events we're capturing, what is it that is going wrong? And we can't teach our alerts, we can't build our static alerts, we can't even build our AI models to capture all of that. So what I believe is necessary is that we build models that help us understand what is going on. And coming back to Ashley's example of tags, maybe there's a specific tag, maybe it's a specific cloud region that we suddenly see having a higher latency, a higher error rate. So surfacing those types of information are going to be valuable to understand and find the needle in the haystack, I think, moving forward. And I would say together with that is like going to a lot of the vendors today are going to taking a black box approach to, for example, AI ops. Now, if we have such a great amount of data, we still want to understand why are alerts correlated? Why are we surfacing something? So I think there is a way to go to more explainable UI, really understanding why is the ML engine correlating specific issues, like surfacing something, so we could use that information to really understand, what is the root cause, what is the impact on our users, etc. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. And so your opinions and insights were extremely valuable. So thanks again.